After abandoning his wife to chase wealth and power, James Walker's empire crumbles, leaving him empty and alone. A decade later, a chance encounter with Mia at an airport, now radiant, successful, and with a son who looks startlingly like James, forces him to face the consequences of his choices. As their past collides with the present, James must confront the haunting question: can he find redemption before it's too late? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. James Walker had always known he was destined for more. Growing up, he had seen his parents work their fingers to the bone, living paycheck to paycheck in a modest home. His father had always told him, "The world isn't fair, James, but if you work hard enough, maybe you'll get ahead." And James did just that. From a young age, he was determined to rise above his circumstances and create a life where success wasn't a fleeting dream, but a permanent reality. Mia had been with him from the start. They met in high school, two kids from the same small community, both filled with big dreams of escaping. Mia had always believed in James, more than anyone else. She was there during those long, frustrating nights when his business ideas didn't pan out, and she celebrated the small victories that others barely noticed. She was his anchor, his best friend, and the love of his life. They shared everything: their hopes, their struggles, and their vision of a future where they would be successful together. When James's business finally took off, it was a whirlwind. He had developed a cutting-edge software platform that transformed the way businesses managed their operations. Investors came knocking, and before he knew it, he was being hailed as the next great entrepreneurial success story. His bank accounts swelled, and their lives changed overnight. The couple, who once scraped by to pay rent, now lived in a beautiful house, wore designer clothes, and attended high-society events. Everything seemed perfect, at least on the surface. But as the money and accolades poured in, so did a growing distance between James and Mia. James was consumed by the demands of his business. He spent countless hours at work, jet-setting to meetings, attending extravagant galas, and mingling with influential figures who lived in a world far removed from the one he and Mia had known. The more success he tasted, the more detached he became. Slowly, he started to see Mia as a relic of his past, a past he was eager to leave behind. Mia noticed the change in him. At first, she tried to brush it off as stress or fatigue, believing it would pass. But as the months dragged on, the divide between them only grew wider. She spent nights alone, waiting for him to come home, only for him to return late, too tired or too distracted to engage in conversation. The man she had known for so many years, the man who once couldn't go a day without telling her he loved her, had become a stranger. One evening, after another silent dinner where James barely glanced up from his phone, Mia decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. As they cleared the table, she took a deep breath and broke the tense silence. "James, we need to talk." He didn't look up at her, his fingers still tapping away on his phone. "About what?" "About us," Mia said, her voice cracking slightly. "About what's happening to us. You're never here anymore. You don't talk to me. I feel like I'm losing you." James finally looked up, but his expression was distant, cold even. He set his phone down, his brow furrowed as though he were about to give a difficult presentation. "Mia, I've been thinking a lot, actually. I don't think this is working anymore." Mia froze. "What do you mean, this? Our marriage?" James nodded, avoiding her eyes. "Yes, I think we've grown apart." Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing to understand what was happening. "James, we've been through so much together. I stood by you when no one else believed in you. How can you say we've grown apart?" "It's not just that," James said, frustration edging into his voice. "Look, I've changed, Mia. I've become someone else. And I feel like you haven't. We're on different paths now. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't anymore." Mia stared at him, trying to process his words. "So what, James? You think because you've made money, you're better than me? You think I'm just a part of the past you need to shed?" "It's not about being better," James said defensively. "It's about being different. I'm in a different place now, and I don't think you fit into that anymore." Mia's voice trembled as anger and heartbreak collided within her. "I've been by your side since the beginning. I sacrificed my own dreams for you, James. I believed in you when no one else did. And now you're telling me that I don't fit into your life? James sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry, Mia. I never meant to hurt you, but I can't do this anymore. I want a divorce. The words hit her like a freight train. Divorce. She had never imagined hearing that word from him, not after everything they had been through. Mia felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her feet. She had built her life around James, around their shared dreams. And now he was walking away as though their past meant nothing. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. How can you do this to me, to us? James couldn't meet her gaze. I'm sorry, Mia. I need to move on. Without another word, he stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out the door, leaving Mia standing in their once warm home, now hollow and cold. The silence was deafening. She collapsed onto the couch, tears finally spilling down her cheeks as the reality of her situation sank in. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. For hours, she sat there replaying their conversation in her mind, trying to understand how things had gone so wrong. She thought of the boy she had fallen in love with in high school, the boy who had shared her dreams and promised her the world. How had that boy become this cold, distant man who saw her as nothing more than a burden? As the night wore on, Mia knew one thing for sure. She couldn't fall apart. She wouldn't let James's abandonment destroy her. She had been strong before, and she would be strong again. But it wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was uncertain and terrifying, but Mia was determined to survive. She would rebuild her life, piece by painful piece, no matter how long it took. And as the first rays of dawn filtered through the windows, Mia made a vow to herself. She would rise from the ashes of her broken marriage. She would find herself again, even if it meant leaving behind the life she had once thought was her only future. James may have walked away, but Mia wasn't finished. Her story was just beginning. After James walked out of their home and their marriage, Mia was left to pick up the pieces of a life she no longer recognized. The days following the divorce announcement blurred into one long stretch of emptiness. Mia had always been strong, resilient even, but this was different. James had been more than her husband. He had been her partner, her best friend, the person she had built her life around. Now, with him gone, it felt like the foundation she had spent years laying had crumbled beneath her feet. At first, Mia stayed in their house, unable to bring herself to leave. She would sit in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of the life they had built together. The framed photos from vacations, the coffee table they had picked out together, the shelves filled with books they both loved. Everywhere she looked, there were memories of what once was. But they were just that, memories. Ghosts of a life that no longer existed. Reality soon hit hard. Without James's financial support, Mia was forced to make some tough decisions. The house, which had once been a symbol of their shared success, was now a burden she couldn't afford. After weeks of deliberation, she finally sold it and moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom space with dated furniture. But it was hers, and for the first time in years, Mia felt like she had control over something, even if it was only her own survival. The transition was rough. Mia had given up her career years ago to support James's ambitions. She had been his rock, the one who stayed behind to manage their home and provide emotional support while he chased his dreams. Now, with no job, no savings, and no real plan, Mia found herself starting from scratch. She scoured the job market, applying to anything and everything, but her resume, lacking recent experience, made her an easy target for rejection. Days turned into weeks of searching, with little to show for it. Worse than the financial strain, however, was the emotional toll. Every night, Mia would lie awake, replaying the events of the past few months. She couldn't stop thinking about James, how easily he had walked away, how effortlessly he had left their life behind. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he ever regretted his decision. But as the days passed and the silence from him continued, Mia realized that she couldn't afford to live in the past anymore. She had to move forward, even if the path ahead was unclear. One morning, as Mia sat in a coffee shop, lost in her thoughts, a job listing on her phone caught her attention. It wasn't glamorous. It was a part-time administrative position at a local nonprofit. But it was something. Mia hesitated at first. She had never imagined herself working for a small organization after all the dreams she had once had. But then again, nothing about her life was what she had imagined anymore. With a deep breath, she submitted her application, unsure if it would lead to anything. To her surprise, the nonprofit called her back for an interview. The organization, which focused on supporting marginalized women in the community, was small but passionate about their cause. The executive director, Emily, was a warm, empathetic woman who immediately made Mia feel at ease during the interview. They talked about the struggles women face, particularly women of color, in breaking through societal barriers. As they spoke, Mia felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in months: purpose. This job wasn't just a paycheck. It was a chance for her to contribute to something meaningful. Mia got the job, and for the first time since James left, she felt like she was starting to find herself again. The work was fulfilling in a way she hadn't expected. Every day she interacted with women who had been through their own struggles, women who had faced discrimination, prejudice, and abandonment, yet found ways to keep going. Their resilience inspired Mia, reminding her that she wasn't alone in her journey. She wasn't the only one trying to rebuild a life after everything had fallen apart. As the months passed, Mia began to settle into her new life. The pain of the divorce didn't disappear. It still lingered in quiet moments, but it no longer defined her. She made friends at work, people who understood her struggles and supported her without judgment. Slowly, she started to heal, piece by piece. But it wasn't always easy. There were days when the weight of everything still pressed down on her. Days when she questioned her worth, her decisions, and whether she had made the right choices in standing by James for so long. She often found herself thinking about the challenges she faced not just because of the divorce, but also because of the societal prejudices she encountered. As a Black woman, Mia had always known that the world didn't offer the same opportunities to everyone. She had experienced the subtle and not so subtle biases that followed her throughout her life, from the way people spoke to her to the way they treated her at work. One afternoon, Mia was sitting in a board meeting at the nonprofit when the topic of an upcoming fundraising event came up. Emily, the director, mentioned the need for a speaker, someone who could share their personal story of overcoming adversity to inspire potential donors. Mia remained quiet as the group discussed possible candidates, but Emily suddenly turned to her. "Mia," Emily said gently, "you have an incredible story. I think you'd be perfect for this." Mia's heart raced. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, especially not when it came to sharing her personal struggles. The thought of standing in front of a room full of strangers, talking about her divorce and the hardships she had faced, terrified her. But at the same time, she knew this was an opportunity to take control of her narrative, to use her pain as a way to help others. After a moment of hesitation, Mia nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." The weeks leading up to the event were filled with anxiety and self-doubt, but when the night finally arrived, Mia stood in front of the crowd and told her story. She spoke about the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the challenges of starting over with nothing. She talked about the discrimination she had faced as a Black woman in the corporate world and how she had fought to find her voice again. By the time she finished, the room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, one by one, people began to clap, the applause growing louder as they stood to their feet in admiration. For the first time in a long time, Mia felt empowered. She realized that her story wasn't just about loss, it was about survival. It was about finding strength in the face of adversity, about reclaiming her life on her own terms. And as she stood there taking in the applause, Mia knew that she was no longer defined by her past. She was no longer the woman James had left behind. She was something more, something stronger. And the future, once so uncertain, was now filled with possibility. James Walker sat in his corner office, the familiar view of the skyline stretching out before him, but today it felt different. Distant, unreachable, like a dream that no longer belonged to him. He had worked for years to get here, to build a life of success and wealth, and yet the satisfaction he had once felt seemed to have evaporated. His office, with its sleek modern furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows, was nothing more than a shell, a hollow reflection of the life he had built on ambition and pride. When James had left Mia, he had convinced himself that it was necessary. He believed that in order to reach the heights he dreamed of, he had to leave behind everything that tied him to the past, including his marriage. At the time, it made sense. Mia reminded him of the simpler days, the struggles they endured together, the dreams they had shared. But as his company grew, and his name became synonymous with success, he told himself that Mia no longer fit into his life. She was a part of who he used to be, and he had no room for anything that reminded him of his old self. The early years after the divorce had been a whirlwind. James was unstoppable. His business, fueled by groundbreaking technology and strategic partnerships, exploded in ways he hadn't even anticipated. He was a regular on business magazine covers, a keynote speaker at industry conferences, and invitations to elite social events poured in. He was living the life he had always dreamed of: power, wealth, and the admiration of everyone around him. But as the years passed, something began to change. At first, it was subtle. Small issues within the company that he brushed aside. A talented employee leaving for a competitor, a deal that didn't close as expected. James didn't worry. After all, he had built this empire from the ground up, and if anyone could navigate through tough times, it was him. He had weathered storms before, and he was sure he could do it again. But the problems didn't stop. They compounded. His personal life, too, had become a reflection of the superficial success he chased. The women he dated were beautiful, glamorous, but shallow. They were more interested in his wealth and status than in him as a person. His relationships were transactional, empty, and every time one ended, he found himself feeling more alone than before. His so-called friends, the business tycoons and social elites, were quick to leave when his influence didn't directly benefit them. Slowly, James began to realize that the life he had built was built on fleeting connections, and it wasn't enough to fill the growing void inside him. As the years went on, James's company started to show real cracks. Competition in the tech industry was fierce, and newer, more innovative startups were beginning to outpace him. He made some risky decisions, trying to stay ahead, but instead of turning the tide, those decisions backfired. Investors grew nervous, and James's company, once the darling of the industry, began to falter. But perhaps the hardest blow came from within. The very people who had once praised him as a visionary now whispered about his inability to adapt, to innovate. James still couldn't accept it. He worked harder, doubled down on risky investments, trying to prove to everyone, and to himself, that he hadn't lost his touch. He refused to acknowledge that his empire was crumbling. The board of directors, once full of admiration for him, began questioning his decisions more openly. Meetings grew tense, and his once loyal employees started jumping ship, seeking stability elsewhere as rumors of financial trouble spread. As his company deteriorated, so did James's confidence. He had always defined himself by his success, by his ability to outwork, outsmart, and outlast everyone else. But now, as the walls closed in, he found himself questioning everything. The money, the fame, the power, it all felt meaningless in the face of his impending failure. Late at night, in the silence of his empty penthouse apartment, James would sit with a drink in hand, staring at the city lights, wondering where it all went wrong. One evening, after another grueling day at the office, James found himself scrolling through social media, a habit he had developed during his sleepless nights. He rarely posted anything personal, but tonight, out of some mix of curiosity and nostalgia, he searched for Mia. He hadn't thought about her in years, not seriously anyway. She was a ghost from his past, a part of his life he had left behind. Or so he thought. Her name came up almost immediately, but what surprised James wasn't just that she was doing well, it was how well. Mia had become somewhat of a local celebrity in her own right. She had started a non-profit organization dedicated to helping women who had faced adversity, women who had been abandoned, marginalized, and left to fend for themselves. James clicked through one article after another, each one telling the story of Mia's rise from their failed marriage to becoming a champion for those in need. He saw pictures of her at various events, speaking passionately to crowds, surrounded by women who looked up to her with admiration. She was radiant, her face glowing with a confidence and strength he hadn't seen in her before. As he read her story, James felt something twist deep inside him, a combination of pride and deep, gnawing regret. Mia had taken the pain he caused her and turned it into something beautiful, something meaningful. She had rebuilt her life, not around wealth or status, but around purpose. And what had he done? James stared at her photos for a long time, a heaviness settling in his chest. He remembered the young woman he had left behind all those years ago, the woman who had supported him, believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. She had given up so much for him, and in return, he had abandoned her for a life he thought was better. But looking at her now, he realized she had found something he hadn't: peace. As the weeks went by, James couldn't shake the feeling of regret that followed him everywhere. His business was failing, his personal life was empty, and now, even his memories were tainted by the realization of what he had lost. He tried to focus on work, on saving his company, but the weight of his past mistakes was too heavy to ignore. His company's decline became public knowledge soon after. The media, which had once hailed him as a genius, turned on him. Headlines spoke of mismanagement, of poor leadership, of an empire collapsing under the weight of its own hubris. Investors pulled out, and one by one his remaining board members resigned, leaving him to face the consequences of his choices alone. James tried to salvage what he could, but it was too late. The company he had built from the ground up, the empire he had sacrificed everything for, was gone. He was left with nothing but the realization that he had spent his entire life chasing something that never truly mattered. And in the process, he had lost the one thing that did. Late one night, after the final papers were signed, officially dissolving his once thriving business, James sat in the quiet of his now modest apartment. The penthouse had been sold months ago to cover debts. He poured himself a drink, staring at the reflection of a man he barely recognized. The once confident, driven entrepreneur was gone, replaced by someone who had been humbled by the weight of his own decisions. As he sipped his drink, James thought of Mia again. He wondered if she ever thought about him, if she had ever forgiven him. More than anything, he wished he could see her, to tell her how proud he was of the woman she had become. But deep down, he knew that chapter of his life was closed, just as the chapter of his business was now over. He had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. The rise had been glorious, but the fall had been brutal. And as James sat there alone with his thoughts, he realized that true success wasn't about wealth or power. It was about the people who stood by you, even when everything else fell apart. And in losing Mia, he had lost the only real success he had ever had. 10 years had passed since James last saw Mia, and yet there wasn't a day that went by when he didn't think about her. It wasn't something he openly admitted to himself, at least not in the beginning. He had tried to move on, tried to focus on his work, his wealth, and the parade of new faces that cycled in and out of his life. But deep down, he knew there was a part of him still tethered to the past, to the woman he had walked away from without a second thought. Life had changed drastically for James. The once celebrated entrepreneur now lived a far quieter, simpler life. His company was long gone, dissolved in the aftermath of bad decisions and market forces he had failed to predict. The lavish penthouse, the luxury cars, the designer clothes, they were all sold off, bit by bit, until James found himself living in a small, nondescript apartment. He wasn't destitute, but he was no longer the powerful, wealthy man he had once been. The most difficult part wasn't losing the money, it was losing the sense of purpose that had once driven him. For years, his identity had been wrapped up in his success, his image, and his reputation. Without those things, James felt lost. He spent his days doing freelance consulting work, but it was a far cry from the empire he had once built. The world had moved on, and so had he, or at least, that's what he told himself. On a cold, cloudy afternoon, James found himself at the airport, waiting for a flight to a small business conference where he was scheduled to give a talk. It was a modest event, nothing like the grand stages he had once commanded. But it was work, and it kept him going. As he sat in the terminal, absent-mindedly flipping through emails on his phone, a familiar voice echoed through the bustling crowd, catching his attention. At first he thought he was imagining it. The sound was faint, almost buried beneath the noise of rolling suitcases and announcements over the PA system. But then there it was again, a laugh, warm and unmistakable. He knew that laugh. He would have known it anywhere. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked up, scanning the crowded terminal, and there, just a few feet away, was Mia. James froze. She stood near the gate, laughing and talking with a young man who looked to be in his early 20s. She hadn't noticed him yet, and for a moment he considered slipping away, disappearing into the sea of travelers before she saw him. But something kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her. Mia looked different, yet exactly the same. There was a grace to her now, a quiet confidence that radiated from her in a way it hadn't before. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a light sweater, but there was something about her presence that made the busy airport seem to quiet around her. And the young man beside her, he was tall, with the same warm brown eyes and easy smile that James had once loved in Mia. It was like looking at a younger version of himself, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This must be Mia's son. But how? James hadn't heard anything about her having children, at least not in the articles he had read. He felt a pang of guilt as he realized just how much of Mia's life he had missed. He had chosen to walk away, and now he was a stranger to her, completely disconnected from the person she had become. As if sensing his gaze, Mia turned, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on him. For a split second, neither of them moved. Then, recognition flashed in her eyes, and her expression softened, not with shock, but with something more like quiet surprise. She excused herself from the young man and made her way toward James, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she was giving both of them time to adjust to the unexpected encounter. When she finally reached him, there was a long moment of silence between them. James opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had imagined this moment for years, though he had never truly believed it would happen. What could he possibly say after all this time? How could he explain the regrets, the loneliness, the endless wondering about what might have been? James, Mia said, her voice as calm and steady as ever. It's been a long time. He swallowed, struggling to find his voice. Mia, I didn't expect to see you here. She smiled gently, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes, as if she knew the weight of what he was feeling. I didn't expect to see you either, she said, but life has a funny way of crossing paths when you least expect it. James nodded, still feeling the awkwardness of the moment hanging between them. He glanced over at the young man, who was now engrossed in his phone, waiting by the gate. Is that he began, gesturing toward him. Mia followed his gaze and smiled warmly. Yes, that's Ryan, my son, her son. The words echoed in James's mind, and he suddenly felt a rush of emotions he wasn't prepared for. This boy, this young man, was the future that Mia had built without him. He looked so much like her, and yet there was something familiar about him, something that reminded James of himself. The resemblance was uncanny. Mia must have seen the look on his face because she quickly added, He's not your son, James. I met someone, after you and I split. His name was Daniel. He passed away a few years ago. James's heart ached at the mention of another man's name, but the pain wasn't sharp or bitter. It was more like the dull ache of a loss he had brought on himself. I'm sorry, he said softly. I didn't know. Mia nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's okay. We had a good life together, Daniel and I. And Ryan, he's the best thing that ever happened to me. James looked at her, seeing for the first time just how much she had grown, how much she had moved on. She wasn't the same woman he had left behind. She had lived a full life, with love, loss, and a sense of purpose that James had never truly understood until now. I followed your work, James admitted after a moment. The nonprofit? What you're doing, it's incredible. I'm proud of you, Mia. I really am. Mia smiled, but there was a deep kindness in her eyes, the kind of kindness that only comes from having lived through pain and come out the other side stronger. Thank you, James, she said. But I didn't do it for you or for anyone else. I did it for me, for the women who needed a voice, who needed to know they weren't alone. James nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had always known that Mia was strong, but seeing her now, he realized just how much he had underestimated her. She had found a way to turn her pain into something beautiful, something meaningful. And as he stood there, watching her, he couldn't help but wonder what his life would have been like if he had chosen differently all those years ago. "Do you ever think about the past?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia met his gaze, her eyes soft but steady. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "But I don't dwell on it. We can't change what happened, James. We can only move forward." James felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm sorry," he said, the words finally spilling out after years of silence. "For everything, for leaving you, for hurting you. I was selfish, and I didn't realize what I had until it was too late." Mia's expression didn't change. She didn't seem surprised by his apology, but there was a quiet acceptance in her eyes. "I've forgiven you, James," she said softly. "A long time ago. Not for you, but for me. I needed to let go of the anger, the hurt. And I did." Her words washed over him like a wave, both painful and freeing. James felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that Mia had found peace, even if he hadn't. She had moved on, built a life full of love and meaning, while he had been stuck, trapped in the consequences of his own choices. As Mia turned to leave, Ryan joined her, giving James a polite nod before they walked toward their gate. James stood there, watching them go, his heart heavy but his mind clear for the first time in years. He had lost Mia, but in a way he had found something else: closure. James turned away, heading toward his own gate. He wasn't sure what the future held for him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could finally move forward, no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past. James sat quietly in his seat on the plane, the noise of the cabin around him fading into the background. His mind was still replaying the brief but profound encounter he'd just had with Mia at the airport. Seeing her again after all these years had stirred something deep within him, an unexpected mix of emotions he hadn't fully processed yet. Regret, guilt, but also something else. A sense of clarity. As the plane lifted off and he gazed out the window, the sprawling landscape below growing smaller, James realized that his journey wasn't just about business anymore. It was about something much deeper, finding peace with the past and perhaps a chance at redemption. For years, James had run from the consequences of his choices. After leaving Mia, he had told himself that success was what mattered, that all the sacrifices he'd made, including abandoning his marriage, were justified. He had believed that the world he was building was the one he was meant to live in, full of power, influence, and freedom. But now, in the quiet of his thoughts, he could finally admit the truth. He had been wrong. The success he'd once valued had crumbled, and the life he thought he wanted had left him hollow and alone. Seeing Mia with her son, her life full of meaning and purpose, had forced him to confront the reality he had been avoiding for so long. She had moved on, created something beautiful from the ashes of their relationship, while he had been stuck, clinging to the remnants of a dream that had slipped through his fingers. As the plane cruised through the clouds, James thought about the words Mia had spoken to him at the airport. She had forgiven him. That was something he hadn't expected, and yet it was something he desperately needed to hear. But her forgiveness wasn't just for him. It was for herself. Mia had found peace in her life by letting go of the pain he had caused her. She had rebuilt her world without him, and in doing so had become the strong, confident woman he had always known she could be. But what about him? Where did he go from here? For the first time in years, James found himself considering the possibility of change. Not the superficial kind he had chased for so long, but real, meaningful change. He had spent too many years living in the shadow of his past mistakes, defined by the choices he had made. Now it was time to face them head-on and decide what kind of man he wanted to be moving forward. A few weeks after the encounter at the airport, James found himself sitting in his small apartment, staring at the business card Mia had given him. It was for her nonprofit organization, the one he had read about so many times, but never truly understood until now. He had thought about calling her, reaching out to offer his support, or even just to reconnect. But something held him back. What could he possibly say to her that hadn't already been said? And would she even want to hear from him again after all this time? But James couldn't shake the feeling that this was his chance, a moment to make things right, not just with Mia, but with himself. He had spent years avoiding the truth, hiding behind his success and his pride. Now he had nothing left to hide behind. The walls he had built around himself had crumbled, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and for the first time, honest with himself. Finally, after days of deliberation, James picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card. His heart pounded in his chest as the line rang, each second stretching out longer than the last. Just as he was about to hang up, a familiar voice answered. "Hello. This is Mia," she said, her tone professional but warm. James took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "Mia, it's James. I hope I'm not interrupting." There was a brief pause on the other end, and James could hear the surprise in her voice when she replied. "James, no, you're not interrupting. It's good to hear from you." He swallowed, unsure of how to begin. "I've been thinking a lot since we saw each other at the airport. There are things I've been meaning to say, things I didn't know how to say back then. I know I hurt you, and I know I can't undo the past, but I want to apologize. Not just for leaving, but for everything. For not appreciating you, for not being the man I should have been." Mia was silent for a moment, and James feared he had said too much, that his apology would only reopen old wounds. But when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "James, you've already apologized. I told you I forgave you a long time ago. We've both moved on. You don't need to keep carrying that guilt with you." "I know," James said, his voice quieter now. "But I don't think I ever forgave myself. I've been running from it for so long, and now I just want to make things right, or at least try." Mia sighed softly, but it wasn't a sigh of frustration, it was one of understanding. "James, making things right isn't always about fixing the past. Sometimes it's about moving forward, about doing something meaningful with the time we have left. You don't owe me anything. But if you're looking for a way to find peace, maybe it's time you start living the life you want, not the life you think you should have." Her words hit him like a revelation. James had spent so long chasing after a life he thought was perfect, only to find that it had left him empty. But what Mia was saying made sense. Making things right wasn't about going back, it was about going forward. After their conversation, James began taking small steps to rebuild his life in a different way. He started volunteering at Mia's nonprofit, not as a way to ingratiate himself with her, but as a way to contribute to something that mattered. He wanted to give back, to help people who had been through similar struggles, and to find a sense of purpose in something greater than himself. The work was humbling. He met women who had faced unimaginable hardships, abandonment, discrimination, loss, and yet they were still standing, still fighting. Their resilience inspired him in ways he hadn't expected. Slowly, James began to feel a shift within himself. He was no longer the man defined by his business, by his wealth, or status. He was just a man trying to make a difference, trying to find redemption in the only way he knew how. Mia and James didn't fall back into old patterns. Their relationship remained distant, but not cold. They spoke occasionally, mostly about the work at the nonprofit, but there was a mutual understanding between them. A quiet acknowledgement that their paths had diverged long ago, and that was okay. Mia had her own life, her own family, and James respected that. He didn't need to insert himself back into her world to find peace. He just needed to be at peace with himself. Over time, James found that the weight he had been carrying for so long began to lift. He had let go of the need to prove something to the world, and in doing so, he had found something far more valuable: contentment. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself all those years ago, but it was a good life, a meaningful one. As the seasons changed, James stood at the edge of the nonprofit's annual gala, watching as Mia spoke to the crowd, her voice strong and passionate. She was radiant as always, her presence commanding the room with ease. And yet James didn't feel the sharp pang of regret he once had. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of pride. Mia had become everything she was meant to be, and he had finally found a way to live with the choices he had made. Redemption wasn't a grand gesture, James realized. It wasn't about fixing everything in one fell swoop. It was about the little steps, the daily choices to do better, to be better. And in the end, that was all any of them could hope for. James smiled to himself as he slipped out of the gala, unnoticed by the crowd. He didn't need to be in the spotlight anymore. He was content with the shadows, with the quiet moments where he could finally see himself for who he was and who he was becoming. As he walked down the quiet streets, the cool night air wrapping around him, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. True peace. He had lost everything once, but in the end he had found something far more valuable than success. He had found himself. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.